What happens when a single glance at a stranger's hand unravels the carefully constructed lies of an empire? For 27 years, Grace Hartley believed her grandfather was simply a forgotten genius who died too young. For billionaire Preston Ashford, his family's fortune was the reward for 3 generations of ruthless brilliance. But on a frigid November evening in Chicago, when a battered gold compass changed hands in a bustling steakhouse, both their worlds would splinter into 1,000 jagged pieces of truth. This isn't a story about coincidence. This is a story about legacy, about the invisible chains that bind us to sins we never committed, and about the courage it takes to shatter those chains, even when doing so might destroy everything you thought you knew about yourself. The low hum of conversation filled the Sterling House, an upscale steakhouse nestled in the heart of downtown Chicago's financial district, where the wealthy came to see and be seen. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a restored 19th-century building, its original brick walls now adorned with contemporary art pieces that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Crystal chandeliers, each one custom-made in Venice by artisans whose families had been blowing glass for 6 generations, cast warm amber light over pristine white tablecloths and gleaming silverware that was replaced after every single use. The air carried the rich aroma of seared Wagyu beef, truffle oil, and wine that sold for $500 a bottle. In the open kitchen, visible through floor-to-ceiling glass, chefs in pristine white coats orchestrated a ballet of flames. In precision, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed performance. The head chef, Marcus Chen, ran his kitchen with the discipline of a military commander and the perfectionism of an artist. Grace Hartley moved between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 6 years perfecting the invisible choreography of high-end service. She balanced 3 heavy plates of prime rib on her left arm, while refilling water glasses with her right hand, never spilling a drop, never breaking her professional smile. Her black dress uniform was immaculate, pressed that morning in the cramped laundry room of her apartment building at 530A. Mercy. Before the other residents woke up, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek bun that took 15 minutes to perfect each day using bobby pins she bought in bulk from the dollar store. Her second-hand dress shoes, bought from a consignment store, 3 years ago for $12, had been polished until they shone, hiding the worn spots where the leather had begun to crack and peel. She'd reinforced the sole with cardboard last month when a hole appeared, carefully cutting pieces from a cereal box and fitting them inside, knowing she couldn't afford the $80 for a new pair until after Christmas at the earliest. Maybe not even then. At 8:45 on a Wednesday night in mid-November, the dinner rush was finally ebbing into the quieter late-evening service. Grace's feet throbbed with the deep, bone-aching pain that came from standing for 9 hours. Straight on the restaurant's unforgiving hardwood floors. A dull, persistent ache had settled between her shoulder blades, radiating up into her neck where a tension headache was beginning to bloom behind her right eye. She'd skipped her own lunch break again, subsisting on stolen bites of bread from the kitchen and 3 cups of black coffee that had left her jittery and hollow. The manager, Marcus, didn't approve of staff eating on shift, even food that would be thrown away at the end of the night. He'd fired someone last year for taking home a steak that a customer had sent back. Grace calculated tips in her head with the automatic precision of someone for whom every dollar mattered, a constant mental tally that determined whether she could afford both groceries and her grandmother's prescription refills this week. So far tonight, she'd made $147 in tips, which meant if the last few tables were generous, she might hit $200. Still short. The math, as always, never quite worked out. Even with her morning shift at the coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, where she worked from 6 to 11 each day, making lattes for rushed business people who rarely bothered to look her in the eye, even with cutting every possible corner, buying day-old bread and dented cans from the discount. Grocery store on Halsted, taking the bus instead of the train to save $1 each way, walking when the weather permitted to save even more. She was perpetually $300 short of breaking even. The hospital had called again yesterday while she was on the bus between jobs. Dorothy's insurance wouldn't cover the new medication her cardiologist wanted to prescribe, something called Entresto, that was supposed to help with her congestive heart failure. $280 a month, the billing department representative had said, with the kind of apologetic detachment that came from delivering bad news a dozen times a day, her voice flat and rehearsed. Grace had asked for time to figure it out, her voice cracking on the word time, knowing there was nothing to figure out, no magic solution waiting to be discovered. She'd have to pick up another shift somewhere, maybe the late-night diner on Clark Street that was always looking for weekend help, the kind of place where the tips were bad, but they were desperate enough to take anyone. That meant she'd be working. 7 days a week, maybe 80 or 90 hours total, but what choice did she have? Dorothy was all she had left in this world. Her mother had died of breast cancer when Grace was 19, leaving her alone except for her grandmother. She couldn't lose Dorothy too. Not yet. Not when she'd promised her mother she'd take care of her. The heavy oak door at the restaurant's entrance swung open with a gust of cold air that made the candles on nearby tables flicker and dance, casting shadows across the exposed brick walls. Grace watched from the service station, arranging dessert menus in their leather holders while Riley counted out change for a customer who'd paid in cash, as a man entered who seemed to carry winter's chill with him like a cloak. He paused just inside the threshold, snow dusting the shoulders of his coat, surveying the room with the casual, unhurried authority of someone accustomed to owning every space he entered. The other diners seemed to sense his presence, conversations pausing for a heartbeat, eyes turning to assess this new arrival. His overcoat was charcoal cashmere, perfectly tailored to his tall, lean frame, the kind that cost $3,000. At the custom clothiers on Oak Street, where they knew your measurements by heart and called you sir without irony. Beneath it, she glimpsed a dark suit that fit him like it had been made on his body, which it probably had. A navy so deep it was almost black, with subtle pinstripes that caught the light. His shoes were Italian leather, burgundy Oxfords by Berluti or Ferragamo, that whispered money with every measured step across the hardwood floor. He was perhaps 40 years old, with sharp, aristocratic features that looked carved from marble by a Renaissance sculptor, silvering dark hair cut with precise attention at an expensive salon where a haircut cost $200, and the kind of posture that suggested both military discipline and absolute self-assurance. His skin had the healthy glow of someone who ate organic, worked out with a personal trainer 5 days a week, and never worried about whether he could afford to see a doctor. His hands, as he removed his gloves, were manicured, his nails perfectly trimmed and buffed. The hostess, Jennifer Wu, a 22-year-old college student who usually maintained impressive composure around wealthy clientele, practically tripped over herself, escorting him to a corner booth. Jennifer was pre-med at Northwestern, maintained a 3.9 GPA, spoke 3 languages, and had dreams of becoming a pediatric surgeon, but even she seemed to shrink in this man's presence. Grace recognized the telltale signs of someone in the presence of true power, the widened eyes, the slightly breathless quality to her voice, the way she smoothed her uniform 3 times while walking him across the dining room, the nervous laugh when he said something Grace couldn't hear. Jennifer fumbled with the menu slightly as she handed it to him, which was unusual. Jennifer never fumbled. "That's Preston Ashford," whispered Riley Morgan, Grace's co-worker and closest friend, sidling up beside her at the service station with the practiced stealth of someone who'd perfected the art of gossiping without being noticed. Riley was 29. With auburn hair she dyed herself in her bathroom to save money, and green eyes that still held traces of the dreams she'd arrived with 8 years ago. She'd been a failed actress who'd been waiting tables for too long while attending auditions that never quite led anywhere. She had arrived in Chicago from a small town in Iowa called Clarion, with dreams of theater, of seeing her name in lights at the Goodman or Steppenwolf, of making her parents proud, of proving that leaving home for the big city hadn't been a mistake. Now she lived in a studio apartment in Pilsen with 2 roommates, went to open calls on her days off that yielded nothing but rejection, and was starting to realize that maybe those dreams weren't going to happen, that she might be waiting tables at 40, at 50, that this might be her life. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of Chicago's wealthy elite, gleaned from years of serving them their $30 steaks and $200 bottles of wine, reading about them in the Tribune's society pages during her breaks. Ashford Industries, Riley continued, her voice barely audible beneath the restaurant's ambient music and the low murmur of conversations. They manufacture precision instruments, aerospace components, medical devices, navigation systems, laboratory equipment, that sort of thing. High-tech stuff. They have contracts with NASA, the Department of Defense, every major hospital system in the country. The company does about $2 billion in revenue annually. Preston himself is worth about $4 billion, give or take a few $100 million. Forbes did a profile on him last year. Said he was one of the most ruthless CEOs in the Midwest. He once fired an entire division, 300 people, right before Christmas, because they missed a quarterly target by 2%. Didn't even meet with them personally. Just sent an email. Grace had heard the name before. Everyone in Chicago had. The Ashfords were royalty in this city, their name carved into hospital wings and university buildings, their presence at charity galas guaranteeing success, their business decisions capable of affecting thousands of jobs across the Midwest. The Ashford Science Center at the University of Chicago, a gleaming glass building where Nobel laureates conducted research. The Vincent Ashford Memorial Wing at Northwestern Hospital, where Grace's mother had died. The oncology department, where the doctors had been kind but ultimately helpless. The Ashford Foundation, which gave millions to the arts each year, funding theaters and museums and orchestras. They were the kind of family that politicians courted, that other wealthy families tried to marry into through strategic matchmaking at country clubs and charity benefits, that newspapers covered like celebrities, documenting their vacations and business deals and society weddings. He comes in maybe once a month, Riley continued, adjusting the small gold cross she always wore around her neck, a gift from her grandmother back in Clarion, who prayed for her every Sunday at First Baptist. Always alone. Never brings clients or dates or family, always the corner booth where he can see the whole room. Never looks at the menu. Just orders whiskey and whatever special Marcus recommends. Tips exactly 20%, not a penny more or less. I've waited on him twice. Cold as ice, that one. Barely makes eye contact. Says maybe 10 words total. Word is he fired his own cousin last year for being 5 minutes late to a board meeting. Just walked into the conference room and told him to pack his office, had security escort him out. No warning, no second chance. That's the Ashford way, perfection or nothing. My friend Katie dated a guy who worked there once. Said the turnover is insane because Preston demands absolute excellence. One mistake and you're gone. Your section, Riley added with a sympathetic smile, squeezing Grace's shoulder. Her hand was warm, comforting, and Grace was grateful for it. Try not to spill anything on him. I heard he sued a dry cleaner once for ruining a suit. Made them settle for $10,000 just on principle. Not because he needed the money, obviously, but because he wanted them to remember they'd failed him. That's how these people operate. Everything is about maintaining control, about reminding everyone else that they're powerful and you're not. Grace straightened her shoulders, checked her reflection in the polished surface of a serving tray to ensure no hair had escaped her bun, tucked a loose strand behind her ear, and took a deep breath that was supposed to be calming, but only made her more aware of how tired she was. She grabbed a leather-bound menu and a crystal water glass filled with ice water and a precise slice of lemon. The glass was heavy, expensive Waterford crystal that cost $40 to replace if you broke one. The kind of detail that separated places like the Sterling House from the diners where she'd worked during college. She approached the booth, where Preston Ashford had settled into the burgundy leather seat, his long fingers already working on his phone screen with quick, decisive movements. The blue light illuminated his face from below, casting shadows that made his sharp features look even more severe, almost cruel. He was typing something rapidly, his expression intent, completely absorbed. He didn't look up as she approached, didn't acknowledge her presence, even though he certainly heard her footsteps. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Sterling House. My name is Grace, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. Can I start you off with something from the bar, or would you like to hear about tonight's specials?" She kept her voice pleasant, professional, the tone she'd perfected over 6 years of serving people who saw her as furniture. "Whiskey, neat, top shelf. Macallan 18 if you have it. If not, anything comparable but not Johnny Walker. No ice, no water, no garnish." His voice was clipped, efficient, with the faint remnants of an East Coast boarding school education smoothed over by years in the Midwest. The accent was subtle but definitely there, the way he pronounced his vowels, the slight Boston influence on certain words. His pale grey eyes flicked to her face for the briefest moment of assessment, not seeing her as a person with thoughts and feelings and a life, but as a function, a tool to deliver his drink efficiently before returning to his phone, dismissing her as thoroughly as if she'd ceased to exist. She might as well have been a robot for all the acknowledgement she received. "Right away, sir. And I'll be back in just a moment to tell you about our specials for the evening. The chef has prepared a beautiful ribeye with—" "That won't be necessary," he interrupted without looking up. "I'll have whatever Marcus recommends. Just tell him it's for me. He knows my preferences." "Of course, sir." Grace turned to leave, feeling that familiar sting of dismissal that came with this job, the constant reminder that to people like Preston Ashford, she was invisible, interchangeable, meaningless. But as she took her first step away from the booth, his hand emerged from his coat pocket to place his phone on the white tablecloth, reaching up to loosen his tie slightly, revealing the collar of a shirt that was probably Egyptian cotton, probably custom-made, probably cost more than her monthly rent. That's when she saw it. Resting on his right hand, secured by a thick, worn leather cuff around his wrist, was a compass. Not a watch, not a ring, but a working brass compass, the kind an explorer might have carried a century ago on an expedition to uncharted territories. The brass was old, burnished to a deep, warm gold that spoke of decades of handling and care, of being passed down through generations. The face was roughly 3 inches in diameter, substantial and heavy-looking, and etched into its surface was an intricate design that made Grace's breath catch in her throat. A stylized letter A, rendered in Art Deco style, its lines flowing and elegant, with geometric embellishments that framed it. The letter was surrounded by precisely calibrated degree markings that looked hand-engraved with almost microscopic precision, each tiny number and line perfectly formed. The numbers were rendered in an old-fashioned script, the kind of craftsmanship that no longer existed, that couldn't be replicated by machines, that required years of training and a steady hand and an artist's eye. At the compass's center, where the delicate needle pivoted on its axis, was a tiny emerald, perhaps 3 millimeters across, that caught the amber light from the chandelier above, glinting like a captured flame, like a star that had been trapped in brass and gold. The needle itself was gold, perfectly balanced, trembling slightly as it found magnetic north with the kind of precision that suggested this wasn't just decorative. This was a working instrument. Grace's world tilted on its axis. The noise of the restaurant, the conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes, the clink of silverware against fine china, the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers, the hiss and clatter from the kitchen faded to a distant hum, as if someone had turned down the volume on reality. She felt her breath catch in her throat, felt her heart begin to pound so hard she could hear it in her ears, a thundering drumbeat that drowned out everything else. Her vision tunneled, focusing entirely on that compass, on the emerald that seemed to pulse with its own light. She knew that compass. Not just something similar, not just the same style or the same era. That exact compass. She had held an identical one in her hands 1,000 times, watching the emerald glint as her grandmother Dorothy turned it over and over in her weathered, arthritis-twisted fingers during long, quiet afternoons in her small room at Evergreen Assisted Living. Dorothy would sit in her chair by the window, the afternoon sun streaming in, and she would hold that compass like it was the most precious thing in the world, more valuable than gold or diamonds, worth more than her own life. It sat now in a locked drawer in their tiny studio apartment on the South Side, wrapped carefully in a square of faded blue velvet that had once been rich and luxurious but was now worn thin with age. The only thing of value they owned, the one possession Dorothy refused to part with, no matter how desperate their financial situation became. No matter how many times Grace had gently suggested they might need to sell it to pay for medications or rent or food. "Your grandfather made this for me," Dorothy had told her countless times, her voice taking on the distant, reverent quality it always did when she spoke of Thomas Bennett. Her eyes would go misty, unfocused, looking not at Grace, but at something 70 years in the past. Her gnarled fingers, bent and swollen with arthritis, would trace the etched A with something like worship, following the curves with a tenderness usually reserved for living things. Thomas was a master craftsman, the finest instrument maker in the country. People said he had magic in his hands, that he could feel the imperfections in metal, that he could see things microscopic with the naked eye. Scientists came from all over the world to commission his work. NASA used his instruments in the early space program. Medical schools taught with his precision tools. Universities displayed his pieces like art. This compass was his masterpiece, the culmination of everything he knew about precision and beauty. He spent 2 years developing the bearing system, getting the balance perfect, creating a mechanism that would never fail, that would be accurate to within a fraction of a degree, one of only 2 ever made. The words escaped Grace's lips before she could stop them, barely more than a whisper, her professional composure cracking like ice on a warming lake. "My grandmother has a compass exactly like that." Preston Ashford's hand froze in mid-motion, his fingers hovering above his phone screen. His entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing simultaneously. The casual dismissal evaporated in an instant, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. His eyes snapped to her face with sudden, frightening intensity, and for the first time, he truly saw her, not as a waitress, not as part of the restaurant's background scenery, but as a person who had just said something that mattered, something impossible, something that threatened the fundamental order of his world. "Excuse me?" His voice dropped an octave, becoming dangerously soft. The tone of a man who was accustomed to absolute control and had just encountered something unexpected, something that didn't fit his understanding of reality. The single word carried more menace than any shout could have, more threat than raised voices or anger. This was the voice of someone who could destroy lives with a phone call, who could ruin careers with a word. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she wondered if he could hear it, if everyone in the restaurant could hear it. Her mouth had gone dry, her palms suddenly damp with nervous sweat. She should walk away right now, fetch his whiskey, forget she'd said anything, maintain the professional boundary between server and customer that was supposed to be inviolable. Marcus would fire her if he thought she was bothering the clientele, especially someone like Preston Ashford, someone who could probably buy this restaurant with the money in his checking account. She had exactly $417 in her bank account. Rent was due in 12 days, and she couldn't afford to lose this job. She couldn't afford to lose any job. She was already working too, and barely surviving. But the image of her grandmother clutching that compass, tears streaming down her weathered face, as she whispered about broken promises and stolen dreams and justice that never came, held her in place like a physical force, like invisible hands on her shoulders. "The compass on your wrist," she said, her voice steadier now. Fueled by 7 years of defending her grandmother's memory against anyone who suggested Dorothy was living in the past, or making things up, or succumbing to dementia. "My grandmother has one identical to it. Not similar, identical. The brass design with the letter A, the emerald at the center, the hand-engraved degree markings, everything. Even the leather cuff looks the same, worn in the same places, dark brown with that specific pattern of creases. There's a small imperfection in the brass at the 3 o'clock position, like a tiny dimple. Your compass has it. So does hers. It's exact." Preston removed the compass from his wrist with deliberate, careful slowness, like someone handling a piece of evidence in a criminal trial, like it might explode if moved too quickly. He set it on the white tablecloth between them like a chess piece being moved into position, a declaration of war. Under the direct glow of the chandelier, the emerald blazed with green fire, the brass casing glowed like captured sunlight, and the intricate engraving stood out in sharp relief, every line and curve visible. He stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tightening, a muscle jumping in his cheek, then back at her. His eyes narrowed with suspicion and something else, calculation. Perhaps, or recognition of a threat, of a problem that needed to be solved. "That's impossible," he said, and it wasn't a dismissal or a question, it was a verdict, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been wrong about anything that mattered, who had built an empire on being right when everyone else was wrong. This compass was handcrafted in 1952 by the finest instrument maker in America, commissioned specifically for my grandfather Vincent Ashford, to celebrate the opening of our first international facility in London. It cost $30,000 to make, worth about $300,000 in today's money. It's unique, a one-of-a-kind piece. There is no other. There has never been another. The technique used to create the bearing system is proprietary, a trade secret. "You are mistaken," he said the last word with particular emphasis, making it absolutely clear he thought she was either lying deliberately or delusional, that there was no possibility she was telling the truth. The finality in his tone felt like a slap across the face, like being called a liar or worse, a fool, someone too stupid to know the difference between reality and fantasy. The condescension in his voice, the absolute dismissal of her reality, of her family's history, ignited something in Grace's chest, a burning anger that she rarely let herself feel, because anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. But she had spent too many sleepless nights sitting beside her grandmother's bed in the assisted living facility, listening to Dorothy's stories, holding her hand through pneumonia and heart scares and the slow decline that came with age, promising her that one day someone would know the truth, that Thomas Bennett's name would be cleared. To let this cold billionaire dismiss her family's truth so easily. "I'm not mistaken," she said, her voice low but firm, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She could feel her nails digging into her palms, probably leaving crescents. "I've held it in my hands 1,000 times. I know every detail on it. I could draw it from memory with my eyes closed. The way the A curves at the top with that little flourish, the tiny imperfection in the brass at the 3 o'clock position, like a small dimple in the metal that you'd only see if you knew to look for it, the exact shade of that emerald, which isn't just green, but has these gold flecks in it when you hold it at a certain angle. It's not just similar, it's identical. My grandmother has kept it for 70 years. She's never let it out of her sight. She refused to sell it even when we needed money for my mother's cancer treatments. Even when we were so broke, we were eating pasta every night for a month. Even when the nursing home threatened to evict her for missing payments. That compass is the only thing she owns that matters to her. And she told me the story behind it hundreds of times. My great-grandfather made it. His name was Thomas Bennett. Something flickered across Preston's face at the mention of that name, not belief, but a crack in his certainty, the smallest shadow of doubt, like he'd heard that name before somewhere but couldn't quite place it. He leaned back against the leather seat, his eyes never leaving her face, studying her like a specimen under a microscope. A faint, condescending smile touched his lips, though it never reached his cold grey eyes. It was the smile of someone who had dealt with countless con artists, gold diggers, and fortune seekers over the years. Someone who had learned to recognize the patterns of manipulation, who had been approached by distant relatives, claiming family connections, by people with hard luck stories looking for handouts, by scammers with elaborate schemes. A fascinating story, Miss
Hartley.
Grace Hartley. She said it clearly, distinctly, wanting him to remember it, wanting him to know exactly who she was when he realized he was wrong. "Well, Miss Hartley," he said, his tone making her name sound like something vaguely distasteful, something common and forgettable, a name you'd find in a phone book attached to nobody's. "Your grandmother is either a liar or a thief. Because the only way she possesses a compass like this is if it's the one that was stolen from my family 70 years ago during a break-in at my grandfather's office, an unsolved robbery that cost the company thousands, or if it's a forgery. And frankly, the craftsmanship required to forge this piece would cost more than your grandmother likely earned in her entire lifetime. The emerald alone is worth $30,000. It's a perfect stone, internally flawless, a rare Colombian emerald with specific characteristics. The technique used to create the bearing system is a closely guarded family secret, passed down only to master craftsmen we personally trained. So which is it? Did she steal it? Did she buy it from the thief? Or is she trying to pass off a clever fake to, what? Get money from my family? Extract some kind of settlement? His eyes were cold, calculating, already building the case against her in his mind. The accusation was so venomous, so casually cruel, it stole Grace's breath. Her grandmother, the gentlest, most honest person she knew, who walked back into stores to return a nickel of incorrect change, who had worked 3 jobs simultaneously to support her daughter after Thomas died, cleaning houses before dawn, working as a seamstress during the day, taking in ironing at night, who gave her last dollar to homeless veterans on the street corners, who volunteered at the church food pantry every Sunday despite her arthritis, making it painful to even hold cans, who had never taken anything that wasn't hers in 89 years of life, reduced to a thief or a fool or a con artist by this man who knew absolutely nothing about her, who had probably never struggled for anything in his entire privileged life, who had been born into wealth and couldn't possibly understand what it meant to be poor and honorable. "She's neither," Grace said, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. She could feel tears of frustration beginning to burn behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction, wouldn't let him see her cry. "And I can prove it. My great-grandfather made that compass. His name was Thomas Bennett. He was the instrument maker your grandfather commissioned. And there's a story behind why there are 2. A story your family probably doesn't want told. A story about theft and intimidation, and a man whose life's work was stolen from him." Something flickered across Preston's face again. Not belief, but something harder to read. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. He studied her for a long moment, his analytical mind clearly calculating something, weighing probabilities, assessing risks, determining threat levels. His fingers drummed once on the table, then stopped. Then he reached into his suit jacket with practiced ease, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and extracted 3 crisp $100 bills, placing them on the table without looking at them, without even glancing down. It was more than Grace made in 2 full shifts. It was an insult, a dismissal, a way of saying her time and her story weren't worth even the cost of his unordered whiskey, that he could make this problem go away with money because that's how he solved everything. It was the kind of gesture that said, "I can buy my way out of anything, including your righteous anger." It said, "Your truth is worth $300 and nothing more." "For your trouble," he said, his voice returning to its earlier efficient clip as he stood up, his full height towering over the booth. "And for wasting my time with fantasies. I suggest you encourage your grandmother to seek medical attention for her delusions. They're a common symptom of dementia in the elderly. Memory confusion, confabulation, false narratives that seem real to the patient. Northwestern has an excellent geriatric psychiatry department. I'd be happy to provide a referral. The casual cruelty of that final comment, the clinical suggestion that her beloved grandmother was losing her mind, that 70 years of treasured memory were just the confused ramblings of a deteriorating brain, nearly broke Grace's composure entirely. She felt something hot and angry surge up from her chest. He stood up, his full height imposing, the power of his presence filling the small space like a physical force. He was already gone mentally, already moving on, dismissing her and her grandmother and her entire life as irrelevant, as a minor distraction in his important evening. He picked up his phone, slipped on his coat with smooth, practiced movements, adjusted his collar, and turned toward the door with long, confident strides. As he walked toward the exit, Grace found her voice, calling after him across the quiet restaurant. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from the place where she kept all her grandmother's pain, all the injustice Dorothy had endured in silence for 70 years, all the nights Grace had listened to her cry about the man who destroyed her father, about the truth that nobody would believe, about dying without ever seeing justice. She's not a thief, and she's not a liar. Your family is... The restaurant went absolutely silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Silverware stopped clinking. Someone's wine glass paused halfway to their lips. Even the soft jazz seemed to fade. Every head turned to look at Grace, then at Preston Ashford. She could see Marcus in the kitchen doorway, his face going pale with horror, his mouth dropping open. She'd just insulted their wealthiest customer, called him a liar in front of 24 witnesses. She was definitely getting fired. This was it. Her career at the Sterling House was over. Maybe her career in high-end restaurants altogether. Word spread fast in this industry. Preston Ashford paused at the door, his hand on the brass handle, his back to her. The tension in his shoulders was visible even from across the room, every line of his body communicating barely controlled anger. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly across the space, precise and cold as a scalpel, sharp enough to cut. Then prove it tomorrow, 10 a.m., my office. Ashford Industries, 1200 North Lake Shore Drive, 62nd floor. Bring your grandmother's compass and any documentation you have. If you can prove your grandmother's compass is legitimate, that it was created by this Thomas Bennett for legitimate reasons, I'll apologize publicly. I'll issue a statement. I'll make a donation to the charity of your choice. But if you can't, if this is a forgery or a scam or just a confused old woman's fantasy, then you'll apologize to me in writing with witnesses and you'll never mention this again. You'll sign a legal document stating that you and your family have no claim to any Ashford property or legacy. Are we clear? Grace felt her knees trembling, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and fear and determination. But she kept her voice steady, channeling every ounce of Dorothy's strength, of Thomas Bennett's wronged honor. We're clear. Good, don't be late. I have a board meeting at 11. He pulled a business card from his coat pocket and set it on the hostess stand without looking back, without turning around. The gesture was dismissive, final. The bell above the door chimed once, sharp and final, and he was gone, disappearing into the November night, leaving Grace standing in the middle of the Sterling House, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might be sick, her face flushed with humiliation and anger and something else, a fierce, burning determination that felt like it might consume her entirely. The restaurant remained frozen for another heartbeat, a tableau of shocked faces and suspended motion. Then slowly, painfully, the conversations resumed, quieter now, with sideways glances in her direction, whispers behind hands, speculation about what they'd just witnessed. Riley appeared at her elbow instantly, loyalty overriding professional distance, gently taking the water glass from Grace's trembling hands. Jesus, Grace, what the hell was that? What just happened? Marcus was already walking toward them, his expression grim, his footsteps deliberate. He was a short man, barely 5'6", but he carried himself with authority, with the confidence of someone who'd worked his way up from dishwasher to manager over 20 years. "Grace," he said quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "My office, now. We need to talk." But Grace barely heard him. She was staring at the door through which Preston Ashford had disappeared, at the business card sitting on the hostess stand like a gauntlet thrown down. She hadn't just served a drink to a billionaire. She had stumbled into a story, his story, her story, a shared story neither of them fully understood yet. A story that had been buried for 70 years and was now clawing its way to the surface. And in doing so, she realized with a cold, creeping dread settling into her bones. She may have just destroyed everything her grandmother had spent 70 years trying to protect. Or she might be about to vindicate 70 years of quiet suffering. She picked up the $300 from the table because, as angry as she was, she needed that money, needed every penny, and followed Marcus to his office, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. Marcus's office was small and cluttered, filled with schedules and invoices and the administrative debris of running a high-end restaurant. He closed the door behind them and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, just studied her face while Grace prepared herself for the inevitable firing. She'd worked here for 6 years, longer than anywhere else, and now it was over because she couldn't keep her mouth shut. "That," Marcus said finally, "was either the stupidest thing I've ever seen an employee do or the bravest. I haven't decided which yet." He sat down behind his desk, gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite. "Tell me what just happened. The truth. All of it." Grace sank into the chair, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her hollow and shaky. "My grandmother has a compass identical to the one he was wearing. My great-grandfather made it. And I think Preston Ashford's family stole the design, maybe worse. I don't know all the details yet. My grandmother has been trying to tell me the story for years, but I never really listened. I thought it was just old grief, you know. But seeing that compass on his wrist," her voice broke. "It was exactly the same, Marcus. Exactly." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Preston Ashford is our best customer. He brings in other wealthy clients. His presence here is worth thousands a month in prestige alone. I should fire you for antagonizing him." He paused, and Grace felt her heart sink. "Here it came, but I'm not going to. Because in 6 years, you've never been late, never called in sick, never stolen so much as a bread roll, and you work harder than anyone else on my staff. You've earned some trust. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to take tomorrow morning off. You're going to go to that meeting with whatever evidence you have. And if you're right, if you can prove your case, then you'll have done something remarkable. If you're wrong," he shook his head, "if you're wrong, you apologize. You sign whatever he wants you to sign. And then you come back here, and we never speak of this again. Understood?" Grace nodded, tears of relief and gratitude stinging her eyes. "Thank you. Thank you, Marcus. Don't thank me yet. You still have to face him tomorrow. And men like Preston Ashford don't lose gracefully." Marcus stood up, signaling the conversation was over. "Go home, get some rest. And Grace, I hope your grandmother's story is true. I really do." Grace left the office, collected her things from her locker, and stepped out into the November night. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing her breath. Snow was beginning to fall, light flakes that melted on contact with the still warm pavement. She pulled her thin coat tighter around herself. She'd been meaning to buy a winter coat for 3 years, but could never afford it, and started walking toward the bus stop. Riley caught up with her before she'd gone half a block. "Hey, wait up!" She was holding Grace's scarf, the threadbare blue one Grace had forgotten in her locker. "You forgot this? And also, what the hell, Grace? Are you okay?" Grace took the scarf gratefully, wrapping it around her neck. "I don't know. I don't know if I'm okay or if I just made the biggest mistake of my life. That compass thing. Is it real? Do you really have proof?" "I have the compass. I have my grandmother's testimony." "I don't know if that's enough." Grace felt the weight of tomorrow pressing down on her. I need to go see her tonight. I need to hear the whole story. Riley squeezed her arm. You need backup? I can come with you. My shift doesn't end until midnight, but I can catch up with you after. Grace shook her head. No, thank you, but this is something I need to do alone. It's family business. It's complicated. Okay, but call me if you need anything. Anything at all. I mean it. Riley hugged her quickly, fiercely. You're the bravest person I know, you know that? Standing up to a billionaire like that. I would have just apologized and walked away. I couldn't, Grace said simply. Not when he insulted my grandmother like that. The bus ride to Evergreen Assisted Living took 45 minutes through increasingly empty streets. Grace sat near the back, watching the city slide past the foggy windows, trying to organize her thoughts. What did she really know about Thomas Bennett? Only what Dorothy had told her in fragments over the years, stories told during quiet afternoons, memories shared while looking at old photographs. Pieces of a puzzle Grace had never thought to assemble. Thomas Bennett had been born in 1912 in Boston, the son of Irish immigrants. He'd shown an aptitude for precision work from an early age, apprenticing with a watchmaker at 14, eventually attending technical school on scholarship. By the 1930s, he was making a name for himself creating scientific instruments, telescopes, microscopes, surveying equipment. During World War II, he'd worked for the Navy, designing navigation instruments for ships and submarines. After the war, he'd opened his own shop in Boston, Bennett Precision Instruments, where he created custom pieces for scientists, universities, and private collectors. By all accounts, he'd been a quiet, gentle man, devoted to his wife Helen, adoring of his daughter Dorothy. He played violin badly but enthusiastically. He volunteered at the local library, teaching children about science. He was known for his integrity. He refused to compromise on quality, even when it meant losing business. And then, in 1952, something had happened. Dorothy had been 12 years old. The family had left Boston suddenly, moving to Chicago. Thomas never worked as an instrument maker again. He took a job as a night janitor at a warehouse, work far beneath his skills and education. 6 years later, he died of a heart attack at 47. Dorothy said he'd been broken long before his heart gave out. But what exactly had happened? Dorothy had always been vague about the details, speaking in generalities about powerful men and stolen work and threats. Grace had assumed it was the kind of story that grew in the telling, that Dorothy's grief and anger had perhaps exaggerated or distorted the facts. But now, seeing that compass identical to Dorothy's, now she wondered if she'd been wrong to doubt. Evergreen Assisted Living was a 3-story brick building on the far south side, clean but institutional, smelling of disinfectant and cafeteria food. It wasn't a bad place. The staff was kind. The rooms were reasonably comfortable, but it was expensive, eating up most of Dorothy's Social Security and requiring Grace to supplement the difference each month. Grace signed in at the front desk, where the night nurse, Patricia, looked up from her paperwork. Grace, twice in 1 week? Dorothy will be thrilled. Patricia was a large woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and an infinite supply of patience. She's still awake. You know her, she doesn't sleep much anymore. She's in her room, listening to the radio. Grace took the stairs to the second floor, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Most of the residents were asleep by this hour, their doors closed, their rooms dark. Dorothy's room was at the end of the hall, facing east so she could watch the sunrise. Grace knocked softly and pushed open the door. Dorothy was sitting in her armchair by the window, a crocheted blanket across her lap, the radio playing softly on the side table. She looked up when Grace entered, and her face transformed with joy. Gracie, what a wonderful surprise. I wasn't expecting you until Saturday. Then, seeing Grace's expression, her smile faded. What's wrong, sweetheart? You look like you've seen a ghost. Grace crossed the room and knelt beside the chair, taking her grandmother's frail hands in her own. They were so thin now, the skin papery and translucent, the bones fragile as bird wings. Grandma, I need you to tell me about the compass, everything from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears immediately, her hands trembling in Grace's grip. Oh, Gracie, I knew this day would come. I've been dreading it and praying for it for 70 years. She took a shaky breath. Help me to the bed, dear. This is a long story, and I need to lie down for it. Grace helped her grandmother stand, supporting her the few steps to the bed. Dorothy moved slowly, every movement careful, painful. The arthritis, the osteoporosis, the general fragility of 89 years, all of it made simple actions an ordeal. Grace propped pillows behind her, covered her with the blanket, and sat on the edge of the bed. Start from the beginning, Grace said gently. Tell me about Thomas. Tell me about 1952. Dorothy closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice changed, becoming stronger, clearer, as if the act of remembering had given her back some measure of her younger self. Your great-grandfather was a genius, Gracie. I don't use that word lightly. He could see things other people couldn't, understand machines and instruments in a way that was almost supernatural. People said he had magic hands. When he touched metal, he could feel imperfections too small to see. When he designed an instrument, it was always perfect. Never any waste, never any errors. He just knew. She opened her eyes, looking at Grace with an intensity that was startling. In 1950, a man came to his shop in Boston, a businessman named Vincent Ashford. Young, ambitious, wealthy. His family had money from manufacturing, and Vincent was looking to expand into precision instruments. Navigation equipment for ships and planes, medical instruments, that sort of thing. But he didn't have the expertise. He needed someone who understood the craft. Grace's heart began to pound. Vincent Ashford, Preston's grandfather. Is that his name? The grandson. Dorothy's lips pressed into a thin line. Then he's living on blood money. Vincent commissioned your great-grandfather to create a revolutionary new compass, something that would be accurate enough for commercial aviation, stable enough for ships, small enough to be portable. He said he wanted the best, and he was willing to pay for it. He offered Thomas $5,000 up front and a percentage of any profits from manufacturing. $5,000 in 1950 would have been a fortune for a craftsman. Life-changing money. Thomas spent 2 years on the project, Dorothy continued. 2 years of 18-hour days, testing and refining, creating new techniques. He developed a jeweled bearing system using emeralds because of their hardness and smoothness that reduced friction to almost nothing. The compass could maintain accuracy for decades without recalibration. It was revolutionary. NASA later used a similar system in the Apollo program, though they called it something else and never acknowledged where the idea came from. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. He made 2 prototypes. Yes, one for testing, one for presentation. He poured everything into those compasses. They were works of art as much as instruments. He etched the A for Ashford, thinking it was for his client, thinking there would be a partnership. He used his own money to buy the emeralds, perfect Colombian stones that cost him 6 months of savings. He wanted them to be perfect. Dorothy's voice hardened. In October 1952, Thomas contacted Vincent Ashford, told him the compasses were ready. Vincent came to Boston to see them. Thomas demonstrated how they worked, explained the bearing system, showed him the technical drawings. Vincent examined them for hours, asking detailed questions, taking notes. And then, at the end of the meeting, he made Thomas an offer. $10,000 for everything, the compasses, the designs, the technique, all rights. No partnership, no percentage, just a flat payment. Thomas refused, Grace said quietly. Of course he refused. The patent alone would be worth hundreds of thousands. He told Vincent he wanted to file the patent first. Then they could negotiate a fair manufacturing agreement. Vincent left the shop angry, but Thomas thought that was the end of it. He thought Vincent would come around, would realize they needed each other. Dorothy's hands clenched on the blanket. 3 weeks later, 2 men came to our house. It was a Tuesday evening. I remember because Tuesday was when Helen made pot roast, and I was helping her in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. Thomas answered. The 2 men were large, well-dressed, spoke politely, but with an edge. They asked to speak with Thomas privately. He took them into his study. She paused, her breathing becoming labored. Grace squeezed her hand, waiting. I listened at the door. I know I shouldn't have, but something about those men frightened me. They told Thomas that Vincent Ashford was disappointed by his intransigence. That's the word they used, intransigence. They said Mr. Ashford was prepared to be generous, but his patience was limited. They placed a folder on Thomas's desk. Inside were photographs. Grace felt her chest tighten. Photographs of what? Of us. Of me walking to school. Of Helen shopping at the market. Of our house from different angles. Of the inside of Helen's dress shop where she worked. They'd been watching us for weeks, documenting our routines. Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. One of the men said, "You have a beautiful family, Mr. Bennett. It would be tragic if anything happened to them. Boston is a dangerous city. Accidents happen all the time. House fires, car accidents, random violence." Grace felt sick. They threatened you. They didn't threaten overtly. That's what made it so terrifying. They just presented the photographs and made observations. Such a long walk to school for a young girl. These old houses go up so fast when they catch fire. The brakes on that Plymouth of yours look worn. Never direct threats. Just implications. Just possibilities. Dorothy wiped tears from her wrinkled cheeks. Then they put a stack of papers in front of Thomas. A contract transferring all rights to the compass design, the technical drawings, the prototypes, everything to Ashford Industries, and an envelope containing $20,000 in cash. They told him he had 24 hours to decide. Sign the papers and take the money, or face the consequences. What did he do? Grace already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it. He signed. What choice did he have? He couldn't risk us. The next day, the men returned. Thomas signed everything, took the money, and handed over one compass and all the technical drawings. But he'd hidden the second compass, the presentation piece. He couldn't bear to give them both. It felt like giving up his soul. Why didn't he go to the police? Dorothy laughed bitterly. The police? Vincent Ashford was a millionaire, a respected businessman. We were nobodies. Thomas was an immigrant's son with an Irish accent. Who would the police believe? Besides, the contract was legal. He'd signed it willingly, technically. There was no proof of coercion. The photographs could have been taken for any reason. The men had never actually threatened us, not in words that would stand up in court. She took a shaky breath. We left Boston a week later, moved to Chicago where Thomas had a cousin. He tried to start over, but word had spread in the instrument-making community, rumors that he was difficult to work with, that his designs were derivative, that he couldn't be trusted. We never knew if Vincent had spread those rumors, or if they'd occurred naturally, but the result was the same. No one would hire him. He took whatever work he could find. He died 6 years later. The death certificate said heart attack, but I knew better. They'd killed him, not with violence, but just as surely. They'd stolen his purpose, his pride, his future. What was left was just a shell. Grace sat in silence, absorbing the horror of it. This wasn't just theft. It was destruction, systematic and deliberate. But the compass, the one you kept, how did you keep it secret? We moved 6 more times in 6 years, always worried they'd find it. Thomas kept it hidden in different places, inside a hollowed-out book, in a false bottom of a trunk, once buried in the backyard in a metal box. He said it was proof, evidence that he'd created the design first. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd keep it safe. That someday, when the world was ready to listen, someone would use it to tell the truth. Dorothy looked at Grace, her eyes fierce despite the tears. And then, a month before he died, a stranger came to see us. Thomas had placed a small ad in an engineering journal, a desperate attempt to find work. This man answered the ad in person rather than by letter. He introduced himself as Jack Martin. Grace leaned forward. Jack Martin. Who was he? I don't know. Thomas never told me much about him, but I remember Jack clearly. He was younger than Thomas, maybe early 30s, well-educated but dressed like he'd been living rough. He had these eyes, sad, ancient eyes in a young face. He and Thomas spoke alone for hours. I heard parts of it through the door. Jack said he'd heard what happened with Ashford. He said he understood what it was like to be destroyed by powerful men who took what wasn't theirs. He said he'd been betrayed by his own family. Dorothy's voice became almost reverent. Before Jack left, he asked to see the compass. Thomas showed it to him, and Jack held it like it was sacred. He said, This belongs to you, to the Creator, not to the thief. Keep it safe. One day, someone will need it as proof." Then he opened his coat and pulled out a compass of his own, identical to Thomas's in every way except one detail. Grace's breath caught. Identical. But how? That's what Thomas asked. Jack smiled, this sad, knowing smile, and said, "Because I was there when they were made. I know where they came from. I know who really deserves them." He wouldn't explain more. He just said that his compass was tainted, that he couldn't bear to keep it, that he wanted Thomas to have it, because Thomas deserved both. He said 2 compasses were made for 2 brothers, one who would build, one who would guard. But the builder betrayed the guardian, and now neither compass has a home. Keep them both. When the truth comes out, people will need to see them together. Grace felt like the room was spinning. He gave Thomas his compass. Yes, Thomas refused at first, said he couldn't accept something so valuable. But Jack insisted. He said he was disappearing, that where he was going, he wouldn't need it. He made Thomas promise to keep both compasses safe, to tell the story if he ever could. Then he left. We never saw him again. Thomas tried to find him, placed ads, asked around, but Jack Martin had vanished like smoke. Dorothy gestured weakly toward the locked drawer in her bedside table. For 40 years after Thomas died, I kept both compasses hidden. But 15 years ago, someone broke into my apartment. They ransacked everything, tore the place apart. I wasn't home, I was at church. When I came back, one compass was gone. The one Jack had given Thomas. They'd found it in its hiding place in the floor. But they missed the other one, the one Thomas had made. It was in my purse, which I'd had with me. Grace felt cold. Someone came looking for the compasses. After all those years, someone who knew they existed. Someone who wanted to erase the last evidence. Dorothy gripped Grace's hand with surprising strength. I moved here to Evergreen the next month. I've kept Thomas's compass with me every day since. I knew they might come back. And now, she looked at Grace with fear and hope mixed together. Now you've found another one. Preston Ashford has one, which means either he has the one that was stolen from me, or there's a third compass we don't know about. Or Jack's story was more complicated than we thought, Grace finished. Grandma, I confronted Preston Ashford tonight. I have to meet him tomorrow morning at his office. I need to bring your compass as proof. Will you let me take it? Dorothy's eyes widened with fear. Gracie, no. These people are dangerous. They've already killed once. Killed Thomas as surely as if they'd put a bullet in him. They'll destroy you too. They can't destroy me, Grace said with more confidence than she felt. I have nothing they can take except the truth, and I'm not afraid of the truth, she paused. I need you to trust me, Grandma. This is what you've been waiting for. This is the moment when someone finally listens. But I can't do it without the compass. Dorothy was silent for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Then slowly she nodded. In the drawer. The key is under my pillow. Grace retrieved the small brass key and unlocked the drawer. Inside, wrapped in blue velvet, was the compass. She unwrapped it carefully, and there it was, identical to the one Preston Ashford wore, down to the tiniest detail. The etched A, the emerald bearing, the hand-engraved numbers. In the lamplight, it glowed with a soft, warm light, as if it held some essence of Thomas Bennett's soul. There's something else you should know, Dorothy said quietly. On the back of the compass, hidden under the leather mounting, there are initials. Thomas's initials, TB. He put them there, so there would be no doubt who made it. I don't know if Preston's compass has them too, but ours does. Grace turned the compass over. The leather was old, cracked. She carefully peeled back the edge, and there, engraved in tiny letters almost invisible to the naked eye, were the initials, TB Proof. She wrapped the compass carefully in the velvet and put it in her purse. Then she kissed her grandmother's forehead. I'll make this right, Grandma. I promise. For you and for Thomas. The truth is going to come out whatever it costs. Be careful, Gracie. Men like Preston Ashford don't lose gracefully. They have lawyers, power, money. They can bury you. Maybe, Grace said. But they can't bury the truth. Not anymore,